Hello, and welcome to a Forum on Spirituality. Today, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. John Nieters to the show. John, a doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine, is a longtime Alameda resident and an expert in the field of traditional Chinese medicine with over 30 years of study and experience. He practices and teaches traditional Chinese medicine as a primary daily relationship with the world because after much looking, he found it to be the most complete, well-rounded, holistic form of healing arts available. John's greatest contribution may be his ability to make the path of Eastern healing understandable to Westerners. He teaches acupuncture students at the Academy of Chinese Culture and Health Sciences and Five Branches University, lectures on Chinese medicine, provides continuing education courses for acupuncturists, and works ceaselessly to educate his patients to inspire the lifestyle changes necessary for self-healing. John has been teaching and coaching forms of meditation, contemplation, personal transformation, and empowerment for over 20 years. John facilitates, coaches, and teaches by inviting inquiry, creating clarity, identifying values, and reawakening vision with his students. John, welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. This is just great.
It is great. So I want to start with your personal journey. Did you know from very early age that this would be your path, Chinese medicine, or when did that show up?
Not only was it not my path that I was thinking I was going to take, I had never heard of acupuncture until I was in my 20s. And this was the early 1970s, and I wasn't alone in that. In fact, my first acupuncture treatment, I was a dumb jock down at UC Santa Barbara. Okay. I threw out my back. Oh. I went to 2 doctors and was told I had to have back surgery, and okay, that's what I'll do. And I had one friend who was very eclectic. You know, and I don't even know why we were friends, but we just had these incredible conversations. And his name was Stuart, and he said, well, why don't you try acupuncture? And I said, what the heck is acupuncture? He said, remember on the old Kung Fu TV show where they'd put needles in people? I said, I'm not going to let someone put needles in me, right?
Right, exactly.
And he said, so let me get this straight. You're going to let a doctor take a scalpel and carve up your spine. I said, I'll go try some acupuncture. Oh. And so I went to this fellow in Berkeley who completely changed my life. Absolutely and fundamentally. And I had very little exposure to him. Out of the work that I did with him, I've never had the back surgery. I have 0 back pain. And that was the inspiration for me to go into Chinese medicine, although I didn't do it for another 20 years. Yeah, so it was very interesting. You know, when I listen to this, the journey, and I start thinking, it's like, wow, what a very bizarre thing, the way I got here. Because again, I had no idea when I was in high school. I was one of those kids that was, I could get good grades very easily. I was a horrible student. My claim to fame was I never took a book home during junior high school and high school, except for 1 semester.
Oh, how nice is that?
Yeah, well, you know, I learned to play the game really well. Okay. And one of my strengths was that I would see patterns. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but I would go, people thought I had a photographic memory, which I don't. But I would go through a textbook or whatever it was, and I would see what was going to be on the test. And I don't even know what that dynamic is. I still don't know today. But if I pick up, say, a booklet before I'm going to do a seminar, I will pick out the passages that are going to be relevant to the questions that people ask. So that was my background, being a very poor student. I didn't study a lot. And then through this series of kind of serendipitous occurrences and then meeting some phenomenal teachers, I started moving into this arena. And when they asked me to be on the show, it was kind of interesting. They said it was a forum on spirituality. Yes. And when that word comes out, there's so many possibilities to me. My patients will come in and say, well, I'm a very spiritual person. And I said, what does that mean to you? Because it's endless, the possibilities of how people look at spirituality. And how I look at it, I wouldn't even necessarily, I don't think about it as being spiritual. I think about it in other ways, but certainly it is spiritual.
Right. So as in the events that were serendipitous, I would think that some people could define that as a spiritual path.
Yeah, a totally accidental spiritual path by my consciousness. Now, I'm sure there were other forces at play there.
Could you share some of them?
Sure,
I'd love to
and
hear
some of them
that.
are kind of strange, but
Okay.
I'll go ahead and throw them out there.
Wonderful.
After the event, when I was in Santa Barbara, and I came up here and had some acupuncture, that opened something, and I started looking at reality a little differently. I became a vegetarian, just without any thought. Any thought at all. I'd read a couple books. There's a book called Rational Fasting by Arnold Ehret, which is the most irrational book you'll ever read, right? But I was inspired by it.
Right.
And I went out, and it was Washington's birthday, and there's a chain of hot dog stores that was doing 22-cent hot dogs for Washington's birthday, and I ate about 10 of them. Woke up the next morning, absolutely was not going to eat meat again. And 20 years later, I was still not eating meat.
Oh.
I did start eating meat about 20 years, but it wasn't something I thought, oh, I'm going to do this as a spiritual practice. I'm not going to eat meat. And then as I got into it, the spiritual dimension became more clear to me, certainly. Then shortly after that, I went on a trip to Guatemala. And again, I was not the driving force. I was kind of getting dragged along. I was working too much, which is my habit. And my wife at that time and two of her friends wanted to go to Machu Picchu.
Oh.
And so we set out and took, buses and trains and ended up going through Mexico. We got into Guatemala, and we got to Lake Antigua, which is now a big gringo haven, and this is 40 years ago, so it wasn't quite as big a gringo haven, but it was as big as it got in Guatemala at the time, right?
Right.
And so we stayed there, and a series of interesting events happened. I met a teacher, had a very short exposure, radically transformed my life in just a very short period of time. Out of some things that occurred with him, the day after that, I was down by the lake, and there were probably 30 or 40 Mayan women and their children out washing clothes and doing things at the edge of the lake. And a state of, I don't even know what to call it, of awareness at that point came over me. And I remember looking out at the lake, and at the instant that my attention went there, every one of the Mayan women and children turned and looked at me and completely locked me up, right? Just presence. And it was like, you watch a flock of birds, how they all turn at the same time and it doesn't seem like anybody's leading it.
Yes.
Well, it was like that. And so, okay, that was cool, and I didn't think much about it. But the couple we were with decided they were going to head on further south. I was loving it so much here, I said, I really want to stay. My wife and I kind of disagreed, but she'd agreed to stay. We rented a place, a little brick hut, and a couple days later, suddenly, I said, we have to leave. We have to leave. We have to leave now. And she thought I was crazy, and I probably was. But, I said, we have to leave now. And she said, what is going on? I said, there's incredible danger, massive danger, and we have to go, and you're going with me. And she kind of disagreed. But anyway, the next day we got on a bus, headed for Mexico. And while we were in the air, the Great Guatemala earthquake hit. And the epicenter was almost exactly where we were staying. And I think 25,000 people died. I don't remember the number, but it was a huge earthquake. Oh, my. And we would certainly have been killed. Happened in the middle of the night, and most everybody in that area, it was devastated. And so that was kind of an interesting, thing, obviously.
Can I ask how that information come to you? Was it?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea, or was it just a knowing?
I'm kind of dense in that way. Well, no, really, I'm serious.
Of course.
I'm going to talk about this a little more.
Sure.
Some people have these wonderful abilities to see things, or they hear voices. I'm not cognizant of hearing a voice. I didn't see anything. It was just, there was no question in my mind.
Oh.
And I think it would be a lot cooler to have the others. That's why I said, the spiritual idea, it was just a knowing that came from the grace of God or the absolute. There was no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And I don't talk about this much. In fact, I didn't talk about this for probably 20 years after it happened. Wow. And then I was doing a vision quest, and it came up. It was like, oh my God, that was kind of significant, right? But I didn't really think about it. In fact, when we showed up back in Alameda where I lived, it was kind of a non-deal to me. We went to visit my mom. She came to the door and fainted. Someone had to catch her, because what they heard is that there were half a dozen Americans lost in the wilderness trying to get out of this destroyed area. And so then it started to hit me a little bit.
right, that it saved your life. Listening saved your life, but
Yeah.
you just didn't make a big deal out of it.
No, it was just part of being, really.
Okay.
And so, and wasn't leading what I would call a spiritual life.
Okay.
I mean, I was becoming more aware of the environment. I had a huge garden in my front yard that the police came and tried to get me to take out. It was a very conservative community, right?
Right.
And so lots of things like that, but nothing that I would say, aha, this is spiritual.
Right.
I mean, I'd done some reading and I had devoted some time and energy to some disciplines, but not much. So that was an interesting turning point. Then I, one day, was in my house, I would say kind of the next turning point, and I became aware that I was paranoid. Now, people don't understand paranoia unless they've been there. Okay. And so when we think about it, it isn't what we think, right? It is a complete and all-consuming state. And I realized, again, the grace of God, I wasn't questioning it, I wasn't considering it. It was like, oh my God, I'm afraid of everything. And in that moment, I realized that this would kill me. Not the things I was afraid of, the paranoia would kill me.
Right.
I went out of my front yard, again, very conservative neighborhood. I owned a house. I was investing in real estate in my early 20s. Took off my shirt, sat in the middle of my lawn and said, here I am, come get me. Nothing came and got me.
I was going to say,
yeah, just to the world,
okay.
right? I've never been paranoid a day since. So it was very fascinating. That was the beginning of what I'm going to call surrender, right?
Okay.
Of what is this? You know, I'm not willing to be bound by this. I really want to have freedom from this. Again, although I didn't call it that at that point.
But it sounds like it was more than just an awareness that you had fear of things.
Yeah, it wasn't fear. We think of, you know, you're afraid of a barking dog.
Okay.
In paranoia, every moment of your life, excuse me, is run by that. I mean, literally, if you take a bus and someone gets on the bus, it's like, do they have a bomb in that bag? Why are they here? You know, are they here for me? And so it's not fear.
Okay.
It's a way of holding reality.
And so for you, you had normalized that. That
Yes.
was your normal.
And I think that happens with all people in that state.
Okay.
They don't realize that for the most part.
And then this moment that you had of recognizing that it would kill you, you decided to get rid of that being your normal paradigm.
Yeah, if you want me, here I am. I'd rather die. Okay. And that was the surrender, I think. I would rather die than feel this way for one more moment. And when you're ready to die, there's a lot of freedom. Right? And so that was again, it's not a dramatic or glamorous story. It's just, okay, I'm not willing to experience this way of being any longer. And that has been the theme, I think, through everything that's occurred since then. It's getting to that realization that I'm not willing to live this way and surrendering to a level that the truth shows up, right? Because I'm ceasing to hold the world in place and manipulate it to serve my self-identity. It's like, great, I don't care. I give up my self-identity. Here I am. And that's what happened.
And then that moment, it changed completely.
Well, it changed all of that, and I think that was what freed up my ability then to do some real work.
Okay.
Those were just kind of, again, I don't know. I was blessed on some level that, I don't know. But then that allowed me to move into what I consider the real work. And it was shortly after that that I went back and started studying with that acupuncturist that I talk about.
Yes.
He's a brilliant Qigong master, just amazing guy, and I was the world's worst student because he demanded that you actually do this work, and for example, you had to touch your chin to your toe within 100 days, which is not an easy thing for someone that has never done that kind of work. Right. I wasn't willing to put that work in, and so he wasn't willing to really teach me as a student, which was appropriate. Even with that, he was such a brilliant teacher that there are things that to this day I can remember his communication of. And it tremendously moved me. But I wasn't really ready to be a student. Right. I didn't know what being a student was. I didn't know how to do that. And then one day, I was coming back down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and I'd driven by this school 2 or 3 times, and it said World Martial Arts Champion on it, Peter Ralston. So that was kind of interesting. I'd been a jock, and I was kind of interested in that. but they were doing some really trippy stuff in there. And so I would stop and look through the windows, and then one day I saw one of my teachers from the other school in there practicing. So I went in, and the instant I walked in the door, I was home. It was the most conscious, clear environment I had ever been in my life.
Beautiful.
There was not a piece of lint on the floor. This is a martial arts school. People are sweating. They're punching each other. Not a piece of lint on the floor.
Right.
There wasn't a smudge on the mirrors. The person that came up to greet me, it was like, oh, my God, you're really here. You know, your presence is so commanding. And so I knew immediately that that's where I wanted to study. What I didn't know is that I didn't know how to do that yet. Shortly after I started there, they were doing an intensive workshop. In my paranoia before, I would have never surrendered and said, okay, I'm going to go to this 4-day workshop. I don't even know what it is.
Right.
It was called an enlightenment intensive. And yeah, and so I didn't know what that was. Again, I'm some kid off the street. And that is where the real transformation began to occur. I didn't know why I was there. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know the purpose. But for 4 days, we did the most intense work. Now, this teacher is one of the most intense human beings on the planet. He was the first non-Asian to ever win the World's Martial Arts Championship. Wow. Now, if you go on TV, there are world championships every week. But at that time, in 1978 actually, there was only one. There was one World Martial Arts Championship. He was the first Caucasian to go win it. Not only that, he was the only person on his team, and he won the team championship. I have read articles about him later, and in almost all of his fights, nobody could touch him.
My goodness.
And he says that he did that as a demonstration of the power of ontology, of contemplation, not the power of being a tough guy, being a tough fighter. So he went as a Tai Chi practitioner, which is thought of as this very gentle, you know, very slow-moving art, which it is.
Yes.
But some of the most powerful fighters I've ever seen are Tai Chi fighters.
Wow.
So he did that, but his love wasn't the fighting. His love was the contemplation.
Yes.
And he himself had done several of these enlightenment intensives, they were called, years earlier, and had several major transformative experiences, and it was his goal to change the world by doing this.
Yes.
And so in that first enlightenment intensive, which is called the Empowerment Intensive Workshop, stuff happened that I had no clue. A level of communication, because we would do hour upon hour upon hour of what are called dyads.
Right.
So we would sit like this, and they would be timed periods of 5 minutes each, where one person has a question, who am I, what am I? But you start out with really simple stuff,
Good.
you know, like, what do you hate about your partner, you know, really? Or what, you know, tell me about your life,
Right.
where your job is to contemplate that and communicate it. The other person simply sits as an empty vessel for the entire 5 minutes. Now, that doesn't sound like much. It's the most powerful form of contemplation I have ever seen. It is so incredibly dynamic, because into that listening,
Yes.
and by the way, it's not the communicator that's the important person, it's the listener.
Very good point there.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Because there's this vessel. And in fact, we do exercises when I teach workshops about being a bad listening partner.
Yes.
So we'll have one person up there trying to communicate their experience, and the other person's doing what we typically do in conversation. Oh yeah, that's great. Oh yeah, that happened to me last week, right? And so you do all these things, and it becomes so painfully obvious that when that's occurring, it ceases the contemplation and the consideration of the person that's communicating. So to sit there and look at someone for 5 minutes and have them only be there as a function, a vessel, a listening of the universe. It's the whole universe is there listening. The depth of contemplation and then communication is so dramatically different. For example, the person that created this is a very old Zen master. There's some debate between my teacher and I. He thinks it was a guy named Rinzai, and Rinzai is a very famous Zen master. I think it was his teacher, a guy named Huang Po, who is not so famous. But when I read Huang Po, it's like, oh my God, this is it. So the reason they turned them around to face each other, these monks, is it was taking them decades literally decades to have breakthroughs into the nature of non-personal reality, into what's true. And so they turned them around and faced each other. Because when you're doing the contemplation on your own, you can go anywhere. You know, you sit there and suddenly like 2 hours go by and, well, what was I doing?
Right.
In a dyad, you don't have that. It's 5 minutes, and there's a listening partner. So you go to the depths very quickly. And what you find is all of your opinions and beliefs and assumptions about reality aren't it. They're not the question. And so there's a lot of clearing out that will occur. Like, well, I'm a man. Okay, that's not really what I am, because, you know, and you start looking into the depth of this. So it's a very powerful process. So anyway, in that first weekend,
Yes.
huge breakthroughs. Developed some of the best friends of my life. Again, didn't think much about it. It was like, this is cool. Well, I went home that night and did astral travel. I didn't know it was astral travel. I had never thought about astral travel. I was just found myself going through my house, going through the neighborhood, traveling all over. It was such a non-big deal. I never even told anybody about it. I'm not sure if I've ever talked about it before, right? But it was like this freedom, occurred out of that. In the work, though, what was very clear with my teacher, he never talked about Buddhism, never talked about Taoism, never talked about any of these spiritual paths, in order to keep it pristine. If you asked him a question, like, Peter, what's chi? He said, that's a great question, right? That's an excellent question. Go contemplate that, feel into it, do inquiry, and when you have a deep understanding, come communicate it to me. I'll be here. And so whatever you asked him, he wouldn't give you an answer. He would help serve you, and he might even give you some direction of looking into the question so that you could experience it for yourself, rather than giving you answers or giving you lots of ritual to work with. And I'm not against ritual, and I'm not against answers.
Right.
In fact, what's really trippy about my life is I am an answer guy. Okay, I get 80 newsletters and journals that come to me, email journals and American Diabetes Association, everything. And I have so many facts. I could sit here and give you facts for the next month. And what I know is none of them are really important. Because what's really fundamentally significant is not knowing. See, it's only out of not knowing that there's any possibility to really get the truth. Right? As long as I'm knowing and I'm throwing this stuff out there, that's it. That's my construct of reality. And I have some really good ones. They're really fun ones, right? But what I'm clear about is that it's the not knowing, the inquiry, that creates any power that I have in my life. Really all comes from that.
So let's talk about that in the minutes that we have left, so that we can leave our viewers with a takeaway, because I know you teach this very deeply also. So at a starting point, something that we could give them, I know you teach inquiry, you teach contemplation. What would be the beginning point for people to really...
Great, that's a great question. Realize that we don't know, and that nobody knows, and it's all made up. And in the work, I finally was working on a question, what is no distance? And in doing that question, and that was where I became a good student. I was burning with the question. I had a partner, and we were burning. It was a woman that I was working with, and we had a break during a class, and we went out, and rather than, we were going to go get something to drink, and we went to my van, and we kept asking the question, and suddenly the experience of no distance was there.
And when you're saying asking the question, internally in your head to each other, or
so you start with the question, but then you have to become the question. It has to become more important than anything in your life. Is this question, what is no distance? And it was like night and day, what is no distance? And then suddenly, out of that questioning, the experience of no distance, which implies also and is no time, out of which everything else arises. So the ability, to see myself more clearly and to see others more clearly and everything more clearly, because it's like putting you and I against a white sheet. We really show up then. So my number one, any experience of this level of power always happens in no time. It is not a long process that's necessary. It is surrender to inquiry, and it happens always in no time, in an instant. So never give up. I don't care how old you are, I don't care where you are, I don't care how much you're suffering. You can experience absolutely, absolutely nothing.
Which
Now,
is pure freedom.
Pure freedom. Yes, you cease to be a self-identity in that moment. You just are one with the universe, literally, not as a concept, but literally. So I would say never give up on that. Find a teacher. See if you can find someone that does dyads, because I believe that's the most powerful form. And look into this idea of vision. The most powerful work that I've probably done with others is work to help them become clear about that vision. And when I use that word, I mean, what is the picture that you have that would be worth living, right? What is it that as a teenager, as a young adult, whenever that was, that you dreamed, that you aspired to, that you had pictures on your walls? And once you get fully in state with that, your life will change like that. And once you decide that there's nothing else worth living for other than that vision, it will happen. And it happens for everybody. I've done many groups, and the shift is, I could tell you stories for 6 weeks, is astonishing. So vision, inquiry, find a teacher who does dyads, and never give up, because it's instantaneous.
Oh, that's beautiful. Just very quickly, when somebody's hearing you say vision, do they do inquiry to find their vision?
Absolutely.
Because you're saying it lives in them. There's some clues in there.
There's one little thing that I discovered. I was an apprentice trainer, and I trained hundreds of people in incredibly rigorous ways that I can't even tell you about. But one of the things I noticed in doing that is there was something very consistent. Every time someone got to the point where they were in touch with their vision, they giggled. Every time. You know, they go, well, I wanted to be Steven Spielberg, right?
Yes.
Great, now we got it, Steven Spielberg. But they always had to giggle because it always seemed like they were unworthy, like it was too big for them.
Beautiful. And on that note, on that giggle, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're wonderful, thank you.
And thank you all for joining us in this conversation. And please come back and join us again on A Forum on Spirituality.